नमस्कार विद्यार्थी मित्रांनो, सर्वज्ञ कोचिंग क्लासेसमध्ये तुमचं स्वागत आहे. आज आपण हिस्ट्रीचा चॅप्टर 2 अभ्यासणार आहोत, ज्याचं नाव आहे हिस्टोरिओग्राफी इंडियन ट्रेडिशन. हा चॅप्टर बोर्ड एक्झामसाठी खूप महत्त्वाचा आहे. यू सी, इन आर लास्ट चॅप्टर वी स्टडीड द वेस्टर्न ट्रेडिशन ऑफ हिस्टोरिओग्राफी. Today, in this lecture, we are going to study the entire tradition of history writing in India, starting from the ancient period, then medieval, and finally the modern period. आज आपण भारतीय इतिहास लेखन परंपरा कशी विकसित झाली हे अगदी सविस्तरपणे समजून घेणार आहोत.
So today's lecture is divided into 6 parts, to understand the chapter step by step. First, we will see how the history was written in ancient India. Then we'll move on to the medieval and modern periods. After that, we'll try to understand some really important ideas like colonial, nationalist, and post-independence views. And right at the end, we'll do a quick revision and I'll give you some important exam tips. या स्ट्रक्चरमुळे आपल्याला हा धडा अगदी व्यवस्थित, मुद्देसूद समजायला सोपा जाईल, अगदी तुमच्या टेक्स्टबुकसारखं.
Okay, so let's begin with our first section, history writing in ancient India. In this part, we're going to learn how our ancestors preserved the events of the past, especially at a time when writing was not commonly used. प्राचीन काळात जेव्हा लिखित साधने फारशी नव्हती, तेव्हा आपले पूर्वज इतिहास कसा जतन करून आणि स्मरणात ठेवत होते हे आपण आज बघूया.
So, the very first method was oral recitals. This simply means that history was passed down from one generation to the next through stories, songs, and poems. The memories of great ancestors, mythological stories, and social changes were all preserved this way. ह्या पॉइंटचा अर्थ असा होतो की प्राचीन काळात इतिहास तोंडपाठ केला जायचा. एक पिढी दुसऱ्या पिढीला गोष्टी, गाणी आणि कथा यांच्या माध्यमातून इतिहास सांगायची. A very simple daily life example is how our grandparents tell us stories about their childhood or about our great-grandparents, right? Those stories are not written down in any book, but they are a part of our family's history. अगदी तसंच प्राचीन काळात सुद्धा पवाडे, अभंग आणि लोकगीते तोंडपाठ करून पुढच्या पिढीपर्यंत पोहोचवली जायची.
Now, this doesn't mean that writing didn't exist at all. Not at all. Indians had mastered the art of writing as early as this 3rd millennium BC during the Harappan civilization. We found many seals from that time with some script on them. But the main problem is we still aren't able to read or understand that script. म्हणजे भारतीयांना लिहिण्याची कला खूप आधीपासून अवगत होती, पण ती हरप्पन लिपी अजून आपल्याला वाचता आलेली नाहीये. आणि म्हणूनच मौखिक परंपरा म्हणजे ओरल ट्रेडिशन्स हे इतिहास जतन करण्याचा एक महत्त्वाचा साधन होता.
The earliest written documents that we can actually read and understand are from the time of Emperor Ashoka Maurya back in the 3rd century BCE. These are in the form of inscriptions, which were carved on natural rocks and large stone pillars. Later, this tradition continued, and we find inscriptions on coins, metal images, sculptures, and copper plates. These inscriptions are very, very important because they give us authentic information about the dates of kings, their dynastic genealogy, the extent of their kingdom, political events, social structure, and even about things like climate and famines.
आपल्याला जे पहिले वाचता येणारे लिखित पुरावे मिळाले ते सम्राट अशोकाच्या काळातले आहेत. ते दगडांवर आणि स्तंभांवर कोरलेले शिलालेख आहेत. या शिलालेखांमधून आपल्याला राजांची, त्यांच्या साम्राज्याची, सामाजिक परिस्थितीची आणि दुष्काळासारख्या घटनांची खरी माहिती मिळते. हे एक प्रकारे त्यावेळेचे सरकारी आदेश म्हणजे शासन निर्णय होते.
Okay, students, now look at this slide very carefully. This is an image of the Sohagaura copper plate. It was found in Sohagaura, which is in the Gorakhpur district of Uttar Pradesh, and it's believed to be from the Mauryan period. The writing you see on it is in the Brahmi script. Now let's look at the symbols. At the top, you can see a tree in railing and another symbol of a mountain. You can also see a structure on 4 pillars. Historians believe this structure represents a granary, a place where grains are stored. The inscription on this plate is a royal order stating that the grains in the granary should be distributed carefully, which tells us there was probably a famine. This is a very important source. हा क्वेश्चन एक्झाममध्ये 2 मार्क्ससाठी विचारला जाऊ शकतो. राईट अ शॉर्ट नोट ऑन सोहागौरा कॉपर प्लेट असा प्रश्न येऊ शकतो. त्यात तुम्ही लिहायचं की हा मौर्यकालीन ताम्रपत्र आहे, ब्राह्मी लिपीत आहे आणि त्यावर धान्य कोठाराचे चित्र असून दुष्काळात धान्य वापरण्याच्या आदेशाबद्दल माहिती आहे.
Another important step in Indian history writing was the writing of biographies of kings. In the 7th century CE, a court poet named Banabhata wrote a biography of King Harsha called Harshacharit. This was a very important text because it gives a realistic picture of the social, economic, political, religious, and cultural life during King Harsha's time. It was a really detailed account of the period. Ya pointsa artha asa hoto ki, Raja Maharajansi charje lihinyachi parampara shru zali, Banabhata yana lihilela Harshacharit, he Raja Harshavardhaneka charge rahe. For a daily life example, it's like today someone writes a detailed book on the life of a famous leader, say Mahatma Gandhi or Dr. Ambedkar, covering all aspects of their life and the society they lived in. Harshcharit was one of the earliest such books in India.
Okay, students, please note down these important questions from this section. For 1 mark, a fill-in-the-blank or match-the-pairs question can be, who wrote Harshacharit? The answer, of course, is Bana Bhatta. For 2 marks, the question on the Soga Hora copper plate can be asked, and for 4 marks, a long answer question can be, describe the sources of history in ancient India. In that answer, you have to write about oral traditions, inscriptions, coins, literature like the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and biographies like Harshacharit. हे प्रश्न तुमच्या वहीत लिहून घ्या आणि त्याची उत्तरे तयार करा.
All right, now let's move to the next period. Section 2, History Writing in Medieval India. You'll see that the style of writing history evolved and became much more analytical during this time.
या भागात आपण मध्ययुगीन काळात इतिहास लेखनात काय बदल झाले हे शिकूया. इतिहास लेखनाची शैली अधिक विश्लेषणात्मक झाली.
In the 12th century CE, a writer named Kalhana wrote a book on the history of Kashmir called Rajtarangini. Now, this book is very special. It's considered to be very close to the modern concept of historiography. Why? Because Kalhana himself wrote that before writing, he critically examined all available sources, like inscriptions, coins, remains of ancient monuments, dynastic records, and local traditions. राजतरंगिणी ही काल्हानाने लिहिले काश्मीरच्या इतिहासावरची पुस्तक आहे. हे आधुनिक इतिहास लेखनाच्या जवळचे मानले जाते कारण काल्हानाने सर्व साधनांची चिकित्सकपणे तपासणी केली. So, what does critically examining mean? Well, it's like when your teacher gives you a project. You don't just copy-paste from one website, right? You check multiple websites, you read books from the library, and then you write your project. You verify the information. That is exactly what Kalhana did, which was a very scientific approach for his time.
Now, this is a very, very important thought from the medieval period. A historian named Zia-ud-Din Barani, in his book Tarikh-e-Firuz Shahi, he stated the purpose of historiography. He said that a historian's duty is not just to praise the king and write about his victories. He said a historian must also write about the ruler's failings and incorrect policies. This was a revolutionary idea because, at that time, most historians only wrote good things about the king who employed them. Zia-ud-Din Barani यांचा विचार खूप क्रांतिकारी होता. त्यांचे म्हणणे होते की इतिहासकाराने फक्त राजाची प्रशंसाच नाही तर त्याच्या चुका आणि चुकीचे धोरण याबद्दल सुद्धा लिहिले पाहिजे. This really expanded the scope of historiography.
This slide clearly shows the difference in approach. On the left, we have Zia-ud-Din Barani's approach. He believed in being critical and writing about the ruler's failings. He also considered the impact of saints and scholars on society. He basically expanded the scope of history. On the right, you see the approach of historians in the Mughal courts. Their main job was to praise the emperor and show their loyalty. They made their writing beautiful by adding poetic quotes and suitable pictures, but the focus was not on critical analysis. Barani एखाद्या प्रकारे राजा चुकला तर ते लिहिण्याची हिंमत ठेवत होता, पण मुघल दरबारातले इतिहासकार फक्त बादशहाची स्तुती करायचे. This is a very important distinction for you to understand.
In Maharashtra, a very important type of historical document from the medieval period is the Bakhar. A Bakhar is a text that contains eulogies or praises of heroes, stories of historical events, battles, and biographies of great men. For example, Sabasad Bakhar, which was written by Krishnaji Anand Sabasad during the reign of Chhatrapati Rajaram Maharaj, is an important source for the rule of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Another famous Bakhar is Bhausaibanchi Bakhar, which describes the Battle of Panipat. This topic is very important. A 2-mark question, what is a Bakhar, is very commonly asked in the board exam. बखार हा मध्ययुगीन महाराष्ट्रातील एक महत्त्वाचा ऐतिहासिक दस्तऐवज आहे ज्यात शूरवीरांच्या गाथा लढायांची वर्णने असतात.
Okay, let's note down the important questions from this section now. For 1 mark, who wrote Rajtarangini? The answer is Kalhana. For 2 marks, what was Zia-ud-Din Barani's contribution to historiography? Here you have to write about his idea of writing about a ruler's failings. And for 4 marks, explain the key features of historiography in the medieval period. In this answer, you should write about Kalhana's critical method, Barani's perspective, the style of Mughal court historians, and of course the importance of Bakhars in Maharashtra.
All right, let's move on to the 3rd section, History Writing in Modern India. This period begins with the arrival of the British, and they brought their own methods and ideologies of writing Indian history, which changed things quite a bit. या भागात आपण आधुनिक काळात, विशेष करून ब्रिटिशांच्या आगमनानंतर इतिहास लेखनात काय बदल झाले ते पाहणार आहोत.
In the 20th century, Indian archaeological exploration and research started under British rule.
a number of British officers began writing about Indian history. In 1817, James Mill wrote a book called The History of British India. This was the first book on Indian history written by a British historian. However, his writing was very prejudiced. He did not have an objective view, and he clearly reflected a bias against Indian culture. Similarly, another officer, Grant Duff, wrote A History of the Maratha, which also condemned Indian culture and history. ब्रिटिश अधिकाऱ्यांनी लिहिलेल्या इतिहासात भारतीय संस्कृतीबद्दल अपमानास्पद लेखन केले होते. त्यांचा दृष्टिकोन हा पूर्वग्रह-दूषित होता.
Well, naturally, Indian scholars and historians did not accept this biased history. Indian historians who were trained in the British educational system started writing about the limitations of these British accounts. Vishwanath Kashinath Rajwade, also known as V.K. Rajwade, is a great example. He took up the task of exposing the limitations of Grant Duff's writings. They started to challenge these prejudiced narratives.
V.K. Rajwade यांसारख्या भारतीय इतिहासकारांनी ग्रँट डफसारख्या ब्रिटिश लेखकांच्या इतिहास लेखनातील चुका दाखवून दिल्या आहेत आणि भारतीय इतिहास नव्याने लिहिण्याचे काम हाती घेतले.
Now, in the modern period under the British, two major ideological frameworks influenced history writing. We will now look at these two views, colonial historiography and Orientalist historiography. These are very, very important concepts for your exam. आता आपण दोन महत्त्वाच्या विचारधारा अभ्यासणार आहोत, वसाहतवादी इतिहास लेखन आणि प्राच्यवादी इतिहास लेखन. First, let's understand colonial historiography. This refers to the history written by British officers and Christian missionaries. The main feature of their writing is that it was prejudiced and often ridiculed Indian culture. Their main purpose was to show that Indian culture was inferior and that British rule was necessary for India's progress. So their writings were used to justify their colonial rule. वसाहतवादी इतिहास लेखन म्हणजे ब्रिटिश अधिकाऱ्यांनी लिहिलेला इतिहास ज्यात भारतीय संस्कृतीला कमी लेखून ब्रिटिश राजवट कशी चांगली आहे हे सिद्ध करण्याचा प्रयत्न केला गेला. For a daily life example, imagine a new principal comes to your school and writes a history of the school, but he only writes things that make his new rules look good and the old system look bad, without even talking to any old students or teachers. This is similar to what colonial historiography did to Indian history.
On the other hand, there was another group of European scholars known as the Orientalists. The word Orient means the East. These scholars were genuinely curious about Eastern civilizations, including India. They had admiration and respect for our culture. They studied Sanskrit and Vedic traditions. They even found similarities between Sanskrit and some European languages, which led to the study of a common Indo-European language. A famous Orientalist scholar was Friedrich Max Müller, who translated the Sanskrit text Hitopadesha and also compiled the Rig Veda. प्राच्यवादी इतिहासकार हे युरोपचे असे अभ्यासक होते ज्यांना पूर्वेकडील म्हणजे भारतीय संस्कृतीबद्दल आदर आणि कुतूहल होते. त्यांनी संस्कृत भाषेचा अभ्यास केला. The daily life example here would be, imagine a foreign exchange student comes to your school. They aren't here to criticize. They are genuinely interested in learning everything about our culture, our language, our festivals. The Orientalists had a similar curious and respectful attitude.
So the biased writing of the colonial historians created a reaction among Indian scholars. This led to the rise of a new school of thought. So now we will study the next phase, nationalist historiography and what happened after India's independence. वसाहतवादी इतिहास लेखनाला प्रत्युत्तर म्हणून भारतीय इतिहासकारांनी लेखनाला सुरुवात केली. त्या विचाराला राष्ट्रवादी इतिहास लेखन म्हणतात.
Nationalistic historiography refers to the writings of Indian historians who were trained in the British education system. Their main aim was to counter the colonial propaganda. They wanted to restore pride in India's ancient glory and build the self-esteem of the Indian readers. They wrote about India's golden past to inspire people during the freedom struggle. In Maharashtra, Vishnu Shastri Chipalunker inspired nationalistic writings. A very important example of this school is the book The Indian War of Independence, 1857, written by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. राष्ट्रवादी इतिहासकारांचा उद्देश भारतीयांच्या मनात देशाभिमान आणि आत्मविश्वास जागृत करायचा होता. त्यांनी भारताच्या उज्ज्वल इतिहासावर लेखनाद्वारे हे काम केले.
V.K. Rajwade was a very important nationalistic historian. He had a very broad vision of history. Look at his quote on the slide. He said that history is not just about kings, politics, conspiracies, and wars. He insisted that history should be the all-inclusive image of past societies. He believed we must study the entire society of a particular time, not just the rulers. This was a very important thought. या पॉइंटचा अर्थ असा होतो की इतिहास म्हणजे फक्त राजे महाराजांच्या लढाया नाहीत तर त्यावेळच्या सामान्य लोकांचा समाज, त्यांची संस्कृती, त्यांची अर्थव्यवस्था ह्या सर्वांचा अभ्यास आहे. Rajwade also stressed that history should be written only using authentic documentary sources.
After India got independence in 1947, the way of writing history diversified even more. Three new major ideological schools became prominent. These were Marxist history, subaltern history, and feminist history. स्वातंत्र्यानंतर इतिहास लेखनामध्ये तीन नवीन विचार प्रवाह आले. मार्क्सिस्ट, सबल्टर्न म्हणजे वंचितांचा इतिहास आणि स्त्रीवादी इतिहास. Let's understand each one of them briefly.
First, Marxist history. Marxist historians focused mainly on class struggles. They studied the means of production, modes of production, and industrial relations. In the Indian context, they also studied the transitions within the caste system. Comrade Shripad Amritdange's book, Primitive Communism to Slavery, is a classic example. Second is subaltern history. The word subaltern means the bottommost ranks. This school of history focuses on the common people, the lower castes, whose history was often ignored. The seeds for this were sown by thinkers like Mahatma Phule, who wrote Gulamgiri, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And third is feminist history. For a long time, history was written by men, about men. Feminist historians focused on bringing women's perspective and their role in history to the forefront. Tarabai Shinde's book, Stri Purush Tulna, published in 1882, is considered the first feminist book in India. Please remember this for a one-mark question. स्त्रीवादी इतिहास लेखनात स्त्रियांची इतिहासातील भूमिका आणि योगदान यावर लक्ष केंद्रित केले गेले.
Okay, students, here are the important questions from the last few sections. For 2 marks, a very common question is to differentiate between colonial and orientalistic historiography. Another 2-mark question can be, what is nationalistic historiography? And for 4 marks, you can be asked to explain the 3 main ideological schools of post-independence historiography: Marxist, subaltern, and feminist history. Please prepare these answers well.
We have now covered the entire chapter. We saw the long journey of Indian historiography from ancient oral traditions all the way to modern feminist writings. Now let's do a quick revision of the most important points that you must remember for your board exam. आता आपण या संपूर्ण धड्याची एक वेगवान उजळणी करूया. Please pay full attention. These are the 5 most important takeaways. First, in ancient India, history was preserved through oral recitals and later through written sources like Ashokan inscriptions. Second, in the medieval period, we see the beginning of critical analysis with historians like Kalhana and Ziauddin Barani. Third, colonial historiography, written by the British, was prejudiced and aimed to justify their rule. Fourth, in response, nationalistic historiography emerged to restore pride in India's glorious past. And fifth, after independence, history writing became more inclusive, with schools like Marxist, subaltern, and feminist history focusing on the common man, lower castes, and women. या 5 मुद्द्यावर परीक्षामध्ये प्रश्न नक्की येतो. हे 5 मुद्दे अतिशय महत्त्वाचे आहेत. Please make sure you understand these 5 points very, very well.
तर विद्यार्थी मित्रांनो, आज आपण चॅप्टर 2 संपवलेला आहे. मला आशा आहे की तुम्हाला हा संपूर्ण धडा व्यवस्थित समजला असेल. अभ्यासाची काळजी करू नका. नियमित लेक्चर बघा आणि पुस्तक वाचा. तुम्हाला नक्की चांगले मार्क्स मिळणार. तुमच्यासाठी आजचा होमवर्क हा आहे की आज जेवढे शिकलो त्यावर आधारित जे प्रश्न मी दिले आहेत ते सगळे प्रश्न तुमच्या वहीत लिहून काढा आणि त्यांची उत्तरे तयार करा. पुढच्या लेक्चरमध्ये आपण हिस्ट्रीचा चॅप्टर 3 सुरू करणार आहोत.